Hello, and welcome back to Part 4 of Chapter 7, Consideration and Form. Last time we were looking at past consideration, Eastwood versus Kenyon. Eastwood versus Kenyon, past consideration is not a valid consideration. Furthermore, discharge of moral obligation is not consideration. Moral obligation is numdum pactum, a voluntary promise without any consideration. Past consideration is not a good consideration for a new promise made after a benefit was conferred, and when the benefit was not conferred at the request of the promisor. All right. Upon retirement of a valid employee, if the employer promised an employee recognition for the past service that was beyond the description of the beyond the job description, the promise would be unenforceable. Past consideration principle does not apply if the initial benefit had been requested by the promisor. Alright, so in Lamplague versus Brawwaite, subsequent promise made coupled with prior request constitute valid consideration. How? Okay, so past consideration may be good consideration for a subsequent promise if the benefit was conferred at the request of the promisor. Brightwood Waite killed someone and asked Lamplague to meet with the king to obtain a pardon. Lamplague had to travel at his own expense to meet with the king. After meeting the king, Brightwaite promised Lamplague £100. The money was never delivered to Lamplague, and Lamplague is suing to recover damages for the breach of contract. Lamplague's consideration was passed because he had received the pardon before Lamplague promised to pay. However, the promise to pay is directly related to Brightwaite's earlier request, and it is treated as one whole agreement. Thus, it was implied at the time of the request that Lamplague would receive £100. If the consideration is coupled with a prior request, is consideration passed? Well, the consideration made in recognition for benefit previously received can be enforced. Reason is that the labor performed at the request of the defendant, and allowing the labor, there was a promise of compensation. The plaintiff is entitled to the benefit. In the case Pao On versus Lao Liu Long, Lord Scarman affirms okay. Lord Scarman affirms a set of rules that are exception to the doctrine of past consideration. Quote, an act done before giving a promise to make a payment can be consideration for the promise. The act must be done at the promisor's request. The parties must have understood the act was to be remunerated, and the payment must have been legally enforceable had it been promised in advance. Page 234, unquote. In Webb versus McGrawan, Webb saved the life of McGrawan. In the process, he was permanently disabled. McGrawan promised to pay Webb $15 bi-weekly for the rest of his life. 8 years later, McGrawan passed away, and the executor of McGrawan's estate ceased all payments. The question here is, can moral obligation create an enforceable promise if the promiser had received a material benefit constituting a valid consideration for the promise? It was ruled that Webb's rescuing Grawan from death was a material benefit to Grawan. Once Webb saved Grawan from certain death, Grawan's promise to pay him bi-weekly for the service rendered became an enforceable agreement. In this case, past consideration will be enforceable. And in Thomas versus Thomas, the respect for the deceased wishes found not to be valid consideration. Consideration is something which is of value in the eyes of the law. Consideration must move from the consideration must be sufficient but not adequate. An example of this would be if you help Mr. Smith with shoveling his driveway. Upon realizing what you have done, he promised you $20 in a day or two. Okay, when you return to pick up the money, he does not have to give you the money. Mr. Smith did not give any consideration for his promise of $20. The work was done before even the promise was made. Thus, there would not have been any exchange on the promise. This would mean that there is no consideration and no contract. Alright? No contract because of the lack of consideration. To summarize, the exception to the doctrine of past consideration are as follows. Alright, number one, the act must have been done at the promisor's request. Number two, the parties must have understood that the act was to be remunerated either by money or some benefit. Number three, the money or the benefit must have been legally enforceable had it been promised in advance, page 234. And number four, moral obligation like that of Webb can be rendered a promise enforceable. The first three rules are necessary precondition for good past consideration. Comes from the case Powell-On. The last one was from Webb. Alright, number three, pre-existing duty rule. The pre-existing duty rule, okay, it says this. Promise where you already have a duty to do is not good consideration. It is a pre-existing duty. Because you are not receiving any legal detriment, there is no consideration. You are doing or giving something you already have to do or give. This type of duty is already owed and is not part of a consideration. A public duty, this is a duty, it's a public duty. This is a type of consideration that is not a promise to perform a duty imposed by law. This lacks good consideration. Promises given by politicians, public officials, and public servants to be carried out in their public responsibility are not enforceable. Politicians are liars. They could be seen as a form of corruption if promises by politicians were enforceable. Okay, promisee may be subject to a public duty to perform the act if in exchange for the promisee to perform a duty, there is no consideration or whatsoever. A pre-existing duty lacks good consideration. There would be consideration if the promisee provides something in addition to the basic public duty. In the case Glass Brothers versus Glenmore County Council, there was a miners' strike. The miners promised to pay the police for protection. The police provided the protection but failed to claim the money when the mine owner refused to pay. The mine owner's reason was it was their public duty. The miner and the local police were at odds on the contract to provide the service, above and beyond the basic in exchange for a fee. The House of Lords held that if the police had reasonable and in good faith determined that the additional protection was not necessary, an agreement to provide it for a fee would be enforceable, page 240. So, McCamus also mentioned that the reward for information leading to an arrest, the court will not be inclined to make this kind of contract enforceable as it would distract them from their main duties. Alright, so this would be the end of part 4 and of chapter 7, consideration and form. Next time we'll talk about continuing on in this duty. So until next time, take care and have a good night. Thank you very much.